At 6:18 a.m. on February 14, 1943, Major Edward Larner stood on the tarmac at Port Moresby Airfield, watching mechanics weld 850 caliber machine guns into the nose of a B-25 Mitchell bomber. The sound of metal on metal echoed across the runway, competing with the distant rumble of Japanese aircraft that had bombed the airfield just 3 nights earlier. Larner was 37 years old, with 14 years in the Army Air Corps behind him, and 3 crews lost in the past month alone. Each loss haunted him differently. Anderson's crew had ditched in the Coral Sea after flak ripped through their fuel tanks. Martinez's bomber had exploded over Rabaul when a direct hit ignited their bomb bay, and Thompson's aircraft had simply disappeared somewhere over the Solomon Sea. No distress call, no wreckage ever found. The Japanese were reinforcing their positions in New Guinea faster than Allied forces could stop them. Every convoy that reached the coast meant another 1,000 enemy soldiers digging into defensive positions, another 100 tons of ammunition stockpiled in jungle bunkers, another week of brutal hand-to-hand warfare through mosquito-infested swamps where malaria killed as many men as bullets. The mathematics of attrition were working against the Allies. Every day the Japanese maintained their supply lines. MacArthur's advance stalled. Every week, without a breakthrough, American soldiers died holding the same worthless patches of mud and jungle. Larner had an idea that might change everything, though calling it his idea wasn't quite accurate. The concept belonged to Captain Paul Pappy Gunn, a 43-year-old naval aviator turned Army Air Corps mechanic, whose wife and 4 children sat in a Japanese prison camp in Manila, while he welded guns onto bombers with steady hands and quiet fury. The engineers at Wright Field called Gunn's modification suicide. They'd analysed the proposal for 3 weeks, running calculations on stress loads and centre of gravity shifts, examining wind tunnel data and structural integrity reports. Their conclusion was unanimous and damning: impossible. The weight distribution would be catastrophically wrong. The B-25 would be nose-heavy, wanting to drop out of the sky on every takeoff. The modifications would compromise the fuselage's structural integrity. The muzzle blast from 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns would peel the aluminum skin away from the airframe like paper. They recommended against any further development and suggested the 5th Air Force focus on proven tactics rather than experimental designs born from desperation. General George Kenney, the new theatre commander, read their report with the same expression he wore when reviewing casualty lists. Then he ordered Gunn to build 12 modified B-25s anyway, and gave him 6 weeks to make them combat ready. The problem was simple in its brutality, impossible in its solution. Allied bombers couldn't hit moving ships. High-altitude bombing from 15,000 feet was like throwing rocks at racing cars. The bombardiers did their best, calculating wind drift and target speed, adjusting for altitude and air density, but by the time their bombs fell through 3 miles of sky, the ships had maneuvered, the bombs had drifted, and the ocean erupted in empty geysers of water, while the Japanese convoys steamed onward, untouched and defiant. In January 1943 alone, the 5th Air Force flew 127 missions against Japanese convoys sailing between Rabaul and the various Japanese strongholds along New Guinea's coast. They dropped thousands of pounds of ordnance, sent dozens of bombers into concentrated anti-aircraft fire, risked crews over open water, where ditching meant slow death from exposure or sharks. They sank 4 ships, 4. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Every convoy that got through delivered 5,000 troops who would later kill American soldiers in the jungles. Every failed bombing run cost irreplaceable fuel, precious ordnance, and the slow erosion of crew morale as men risked their lives for nothing. The Japanese knew it. They were exploiting it. Their convoys sailed in broad daylight now, confident the American bombers couldn't touch them. Their deck gunners lounging in the sun, while destroyers cut white wakes through blue water. Captain Gunn had proposed a different approach 6 months earlier, though proposed was too formal a word for what had happened. He'd simply started modifying aircraft in the middle of the night, stripping 50 caliber guns from wrecked P-40 fighters, whose pilots were dead or crippled, welding them into bomber noses where bombardiers used to sit, installing ammunition feeds and gun sights and blast tubes while official channels debated feasibility studies. His approach was called skip bombing, fly low enough that bombs would skip across the water like stones thrown by children at ponds, hit ships at point-blank range, where even mediocre aim couldn't miss. But there was a problem, large and lethal, and completely obvious. Flying low meant flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire at ranges where Japanese deck gunners could hardly miss. Every ship carried multiple gun positions. Every destroyer had dedicated anti-aircraft crews. Flying a bomber through that fire at 50 feet was statistical suicide. The math said you'd be shredded before you ever dropped your bombs. Gunn's solution was as radical as it was simple. Don't avoid the gunfire, suppress it. Turn bombers into strafers. Mount forward-firing machine guns in the nose. Overwhelm the enemy gunners with such concentrated firepower that they'd be dead before they could shoot back. Kill them first, bomb them second, get out before reinforcements arrived. The Wright Field engineers had analysed this proposal with the thoroughness that peacetime engineering required. They'd examined stress calculations and performed load distribution analysis. They'd reviewed wind tunnel data and calculated the centre of gravity shift that 4 64-pound guns plus 200 pounds of ammunition would create. They'd studied the muzzle blast effects on aluminum skin and examined the structural integrity of a bomber nose never designed to handle 8 synchronized machine guns firing 2,400 rounds per minute. Their conclusion was technically sound and operationally damning. Impossible. The weight distribution would be wrong. The B-25 would be nose-heavy, requiring constant back pressure on the control stick just to maintain level flight. It wouldn't fly properly. The modifications would compromise structural integrity. They recommended grounding any aircraft modified in this manner and suggested court-martial proceedings for anyone who attempted such modifications without proper authorization. The report was 47 pages long, thoroughly researched, technically impeccable, and completely wrong about what mattered. General Kenny read the executive summary, walked to his operations office, and ordered Gunn to build 12 modified B-25s within 6 weeks. If they worked, he'd order 100 more. If they didn't, at least they tried something different before losing the war through conventional failure. Gunn started with wrecked P-40 fighters scattered around Australian airfields, casualties of combat and operational accidents, aircraft too damaged to fly again, but with guns that still worked. 450 caliber machine guns per fighter, each weapon weighing 64 pounds of steel and machinery designed to punch through aircraft armor at 2,800 feet per second. He stripped them from the wreckage with cutting torches and persistence, collected them like grim trophies, and mounted them in the B-25's nose, where the bombardier used to sit with his Norden bomb sight and targeting calculation. Then he added 4 more guns in external cheek packs that bulged from the fuselage like metallic tumours. 8 forward-firing guns total. 2,400 rounds per minute combined. 40 rounds per second. A stream of lead that would turn air into a kill zone and ships into death traps. The test pilot reported the plane was angry, that it wanted to nosedive on takeoff, that flying it required constant physical effort and concentration. Gunn spent 4 days rebalancing the aircraft, moving radio equipment aft to shift weight, adjusting fuel tank positions, recalculating the center of gravity 3 times with pencil and paper, while Wright Field engineers sat in Ohio offices writing reports about why this wouldn't work. The second test flight was better. The pilot said it flew like a truck designed by someone who'd never seen a truck, but it flew. And flying was what mattered. By January 1943, 6 weeks after Kenny's order, Gunn had 12 modified B-25s ready for combat. The aircraft sat on the Port Moresby runway, like mechanical predators, their noses bristling with gun barrels, their crews uncertain whether they were flying innovative weapons or elaborate coffins. Major Larner was assigned to lead them into combat. He'd flown 47 missions in standard bombers, watched bombs miss their targets from 15,000 feet, seen what Japanese anti-aircraft fire could do to aluminum airframes, and understood that flying at mast height with 8 guns blazing was either brilliant innovation or elaborate suicide. He'd find out which on the next mission, though find out implied survival, and survival wasn't guaranteed for anyone anymore. The intelligence report arrived on February 28, 1943, decoded from intercepted Japanese naval communications by cryptographers in Melbourne who worked 16-hour shifts in underground bunkers, breaking enemy codes while the future of the Pacific War hung on their ability to read encrypted messages before those messages became obsolete. A Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul. 8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, 6,900 troops bound for Lae on New Guinea's north coast, where they'd reinforce defensive positions and extend Japanese control deeper into the island. The convoy route crossed the Bismarck Sea, 400 miles of open water between New Britain and New Guinea. The Japanese commanders believed monsoon weather would shield them. It was March now, the height of monsoon season, when low clouds hung like grey curtains over the ocean, when heavy rain reduced visibility to hundreds of yards, when flying became dangerous even without enemy fire. Allied bombers couldn't hit what they couldn't see. They were right about the weather. They were profoundly, catastrophically wrong about what was coming. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy on March 2nd, flying through gaps in the cloud cover, at risks that killed 2 scout planes that week when they flew into thunderstorms that threw aircraft around like toys. B-17 flying fortresses attacked from high altitude through cloud breaks, their bombardiers doing their best with limited visibility and moving targets. They dropped 137 bombs. Post-battle analysis later showed they hit nothing. The bombs created spectacular geysers of white water. The concussions probably rattled dishes on the Japanese ships, but no vessels sank. No significant damage occurred. The Japanese convoy kept coming, their commanders probably laughing at American incompetence, their troops below decks playing cards and writing letters home, while destroyers cut protective patterns through the waves. That night, back at Port Moresby, Larner briefed his squadron in a tent that smelled of canvas and aviation fuel, and the particular staleness that came from too many men living in too small a space for too long. 12 B-25 strafers with their 8 forward-firing guns, 30 modified A-20 Havocs carrying additional firepower, Australian bow fighters for top cover, their crews eager to fight after watching Japanese bombers hit Australian cities, P-38 Lightnings to handle Japanese Zeros if enemy fighters showed up. The plan was straightforward in concept, terrifying in execution. Come in at 50 feet above the water, low, enough that the curve of the earth would hide them until the last possible moment. Overwhelm the deck guns with such concentrated firepower that Japanese gunners would be dead before they could respond. Drop skip bombs while the ships were stunned and burning. Get out fast before Zeros arrived from nearby airfields. Larner had flown exactly 1 practice mission using this tactic, 1 training run over empty ocean, where they'd bombed target barges and pretended return fire wasn't happening. His navigator, a 22-year-old kid from Nebraska who'd been doing trigonometry problems in a college classroom 18 months earlier, asked what happened if they took fire during the approach, if the Japanese gunners weren't as stunned as hoped, if the skip bombs missed. Larner said they'd find out tomorrow, and nobody laughed because tomorrow was real, and death was real, and finding out meant some of them wouldn't be at the next briefing. Nobody slept that night. Men lay in cots listening to rain drum on tent canvas, thinking about families they might not see again, writing letters they hoped wouldn't be delivered posthumously. At 6:30 a.m. on March 3rd, 1943, the strike force assembled over Cape Ward Hunt on New Guinea's northern coast. 137 aircraft in total, the largest strike force the 5th Air Force had assembled since the war began. The Japanese convoy was 70 miles northwest of Lae when they arrived, the ships still confident in their weather shield, their crews still believing American bombers couldn't hurt them. The B-17s attacked first from altitude, their purpose not to sink ships, but to draw defensive fire upward, to make Japanese gunners look at the sky instead of the sea. The transports opened up with every anti-aircraft gun they had, the sky filled with black puffs of flak that could shred an aircraft or pass harmlessly by, the difference between life and death measured in yards and luck. 1 B-17 took damage and turned back, trailing smoke. The rest pressed their attack, dropping bombs that again missed, but that wasn't the point anymore. The point was distraction. Then the strafers came in low wave-top height, 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea. Larner led 12 B-25s from the southeast in a formation that put 8 forward-firing guns per aircraft into a single devastating line. 96 guns total across 12 bombers. They came in line abreast, a wall of firepower 300 yards wide, a mechanical hurricane bearing down on ships whose crews suddenly understood that everything had changed. The Japanese transport Kyokusei Maru saw them at 2 miles, close enough for lookouts to identify aircraft type, far enough that they thought they had time to respond. The captain ordered hard to starboard, trying to turn the ship to present a smaller target, but ships don't turn like aircraft, and 2 miles became 1 mile, became nothing at all in the seconds it took the B-25s to close the distance. They opened fire at 800 yards. The 50 caliber rounds walked across the water like a chainsaw cutting through wood, tracers making visible lines through air and spray, creating a sound like thunder that never stopped. The rounds hit the ship's superstructure, punched through steel plate that had seemed substantial until it wasn't, shredded the bridge where officers stood with binoculars, and suddenly died with those binoculars still in their hands, killed anti-aircraft crews before they could traverse their guns toward threats they'd barely begun to perceive. 3 B-25s dropped bombs at 100 yards, close enough to see individual soldiers on deck, close enough that the bomber crews later reported smelling the smoke from Japanese ships. The first bomb skipped off the water, hit the hull below the waterline, where armor was thinnest, detonated inside the engine room, where it killed everyone instantly and destroyed the machinery that kept the ship alive. The second bomb hit amidships, blowing through multiple decks. The third bomb missed, creating a geyser of water that drenched the already burning ship. Kyokusei Maru was dead in the water 30 seconds after the strafers arrived, burning from multiple fires, listing to port as water flooded through a hole in her hull big enough to drive a truck through. The ship would sink in 40 minutes, taking most of her crew and cargo with her. The transport Teiyo Maru tried to run, her captain pushing engines to full speed, achieving 15 knots maximum, a pace that seemed fast until measured against B-25s doing 240 knots. The mathematics were simple and merciless. 4 strafers bracketed Teiyo Maru from both sides, creating crossfire that gave the Japanese gunners no safe direction to face. The 50 caliber streams converged on the deck from 2 directions simultaneously. Anti-aircraft crews died at their guns, cut down before they could fire a single shot. The bridge windows shattered. The ship's executive officer took 3 rounds through the chest and died without understanding what had killed him. The captain lasted another 10 seconds before a burst cut him down. 8 bombs dropped from 4 aircraft. 5 hit, each one a hammer blow against a ship that had never been designed to withstand this kind of punishment. The ship broke in half, the 2 sections separating as internal bulkheads failed and water rushed in. Japanese soldiers were below decks when the hull split, trapped in compartments that became steel coffins. Most never made it topside. The transport sank in 6 minutes flat, her bow and stern pointing at different angles toward a sky they'd never reach. Survivors jumped into the Bismarck Sea, wearing full combat gear, their rifles and ammunition packs, and steel helmets dragging them under as surely as any anchor. The ocean didn't care about courage or training, it just pulled them down. The destroyer Shikinami tried to screen the transports, putting her armoured hull between the bombers and the vulnerable cargo ships, her anti-aircraft guns tracking targets that moved too fast and came from too many directions. Australian bow fighters strafed her decks first, coming in from another angle, adding their guns to a battle that had become a symphony of violence. The destroyer's anti-aircraft fire hit one bow fighter, punching holes through one wing, but the Australian pilot kept coming, his forward guns raking the destroyer from bow to stern, killing gun crews who were trying to track too many threats at once. When the B-25 strafers arrived moments later, Shikinami had no defense left. 3 strafers attacked from different angles, port side, starboard side, and stern, creating a 3-dimensional kill box that gave the destroyer nowhere to turn. The destroyer's captain tried to maneuver into the attack, presenting the smallest target profile, but ships don't dodge like aircraft, and desperation doesn't change physics. Bombs hit port side, starboard side, and amidships. The destroyer didn't sink immediately, but she was finished, dead in the water, fires spreading through her superstructure, fuel oil leaking from ruptured tanks. The crew abandoned ship 2 hours later, jumping into water that was already full of bodies and debris and sharks that had learned what bombing runs meant. By 9:01 a.m. on March 3rd, barely 3 hours after the strike force assembled, the Japanese convoy was scattered across 40 square miles of ocean like pieces of a shattered puzzle. 5 transports were sinking or burning, their crews abandoning ship or already dead. their cargo of troops and ammunition settling toward the ocean floor. 2 destroyers were crippled, unable to maneuver or defend themselves, their fates sealed even if the final sinking would take hours. The remaining ships tried to reach Leh, but reaching Leh meant surviving another 7 hours of daylight, and daylight meant more bombing runs. They didn't make it. Have you ever had to prove something everyone said was impossible? When the stakes were so high that failure meant not just personal defeat, but the deaths of thousands? That's where Larner and his crews were on March 3rd, 1943. If this worked, it would validate Gunn's modifications, prove that the Wright Field engineers were wrong, change how the entire 5th Air Force fought the war. If it didn't work, if the impossible really was impossible, they'd die proving it, and the war would continue grinding through soldiers and ships and aircraft until one side or the other simply ran out. If you understand that feeling, that moment when everything depends on being right against all official wisdom, then you're part of this story too. You understand what it meant when those 12 B-25s came in at wave-top height with 8 guns blazing and made the impossible real. Join our community at WW2 Shadow Tales. We rescue these forgotten moments together. These stories about people who refuse to accept impossible as an answer. The strafers returned at 2 hulls PM, refueled and rearmed, carrying fresh bombs and full ammunition loads. The Japanese had no fighter cover. The Zeros had landed at Leh to refuel, sitting on runways when the second wave arrived overhead, their pilots probably watching in horror as their convoy died without them. The transport Oigawa Maru took 12 bomb hits in the second attack, bombs that punched through her decks and detonated in the spaces below. The ship's magazine exploded. The blast was visible from Port Moresby 130 miles away, a mushroom cloud of smoke and fire that climbed thousands of feet into the monsoon sky. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. No wreckage, no survivors, no evidence that a ship carrying 1,800 Japanese soldiers had existed moments before. 1,800 men gone in 3 seconds, vaporized by their own ammunition in an explosion that made the ocean itself seem to flinch. By evening on March 3rd, the entire Japanese convoy was destroyed. 8 transports sunk. Every single cargo ship that had left Rabaul was now on the ocean floor. 4 destroyers sunk, half the escort force gone. Of nearly 7,000 Japanese troops that had left Rabaul confident in weather protection and Japanese naval superiority, fewer than 200 reached Leh, arriving as scattered survivors rather than an organized fighting force. Another 2,700 were rescued by remaining destroyers and returned to Rabaul, their combat effectiveness destroyed even if their bodies survived. The rest died in the Bismarck Sea, either in the initial attacks or in the hours afterward when they found themselves in open ocean without rescue, where exhaustion and exposure and sharks finished what bombs had started. Allied losses: 4 aircraft total, 1 B-17, 3 P-38s, and 13 aircrew killed. 13 deaths to kill nearly 5,000 enemy soldiers, sink 12 warships, and change the course of the Pacific War. The exchange ratio was so lopsided it seemed fictional, but the wreckage on the ocean floor testified to its truth. General Douglas MacArthur, never shy about dramatic pronouncements, called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. He was prone to hyperbole, but this time he was right. The Japanese never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by convoy. The risk was too great, the losses too certain. From March 1943 onward, Japanese garrisons in New Guinea withered from lack of supplies, their soldiers starving slowly while their ammunition dwindled and their defensive positions crumbled. The war in the Southwest Pacific had turned at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, and it turned because Paul Gunn had welded 8 50 caliber machine guns into a bomber nose, while Wright Field engineers wrote reports about why it was impossible. Back in Ohio, those Wright Field engineers were still drafting their formal report, still explaining with charts and calculations why the B-25 modifications couldn't possibly work, still recommending against further development. General Kenny sent a message to General Hap Arnold in Washington on March 5th. The subject line read, "Commerce Destroyer Modifications Approved for Production." The body contained one paragraph. 12 B-25 strafers had just destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. Request immediate factory integration of forward gun package into all B-25 production aircraft. Arnold called North American Aviation that afternoon. The factory in California started production modifications within a week. The engineers in Ohio filed their report and never spoke of it again. North American Aviation built 400 B-25G strafers with 8 forward-firing guns and a 75mm cannon mounted in the nose. Then they built 1,000 B-25H models with 14 forward-firing guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in cheek packs, 2 in a top turret rotated forward. Then they built 4,118 B-25J models with 18 forward-firing guns, the most heavily armed production bomber in history, each one a flying testament to what happens when field innovation meets desperate necessity. Every variant was based on Pappy Gunn's original field modifications. Everyone proved that impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. The strafers kept hunting through 1944 and into 1945. They destroyed 16 Japanese barges near Finschhafen, 12 cargo ships at Wewak Harbour, oil facilities at Balikpapan. The Japanese stopped moving supplies by ship in daylight, so the strafers learned to attack at night using radar, coordinating with PT boats that illuminated targets with searchlights at the last second. The Japanese called the modified B-25s the Black Death, and the name fit like a prophecy. By war's end, B-25 strafers had sunk over 800 Japanese vessels, destroyed more than 2,000 aircraft on the ground, killed an estimated 85,000 enemy soldiers. But the real impact was conceptual. The strafer changed how air forces thought about bombers forever. Before Gunn, bombers dropped ordnance from altitude. After Gunn, bombers became multi-role weapons capable of strafing, skip bombing, and close air support. The AC-130 gunship used in Vietnam was a direct descendant. So was the A-10 Warthog. So is every modern attack aircraft with forward-firing guns. Gunn's impossible modification in a tent at Port Moresby changed military aviation forever. Major Edward Larner flew 73 combat missions in modified B-25s. He survived the war, retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1956, died in 1982 at age 76. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his distinguished flying cross. It mentioned the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It didn't mention that he'd commanded the first strike force to prove an impossible weapon could work, that he'd led 12 bombers into concentrated enemy fire at 50 feet because someone had to be first, that his actions on March 3rd, 1943 changed naval warfare forever. 4 paragraphs, then silent. Paul Gunn continued modifying aircraft through the war, adding fuel tanks for extended range, improving gun cooling systems, developing new ammunition loading techniques that other mechanics copied without knowing his name. He flew combat missions when he could have stayed safe in rear areas. He survived the war. His family survived Santo Tomas internment camp. He died in a plane crash in the Philippines in 1957, age 57. The Manila Times published his obituary. Headline: War Hero Dies in Plane Crash. Most people reading it had never heard of him. Most people still haven't. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, displays one of Gunn's original gun mounting drawings. The paper is yellowed with age. The measurements are handwritten in pencil. There are no stress calculations, no computer modeling, no engineering stamps, just a sketch showing 450 caliber guns mounted in an A-20 nose compartment. That sketch helped sink 800 Japanese ships. It sits behind glass in a quiet corner. Most visitors walk past it without stopping, heading toward larger displays about famous battles and well-known generals. But you didn't walk past. You're here now, reading this, learning what happened on March 3rd, 1943. You know about the 12 impossible gunships that destroyed an entire convoy. You know about the men who flew them when everyone said it couldn't be done. You know about Pappy Gunn welding guns in the dark, while engineers wrote reports about impossibility. That matters more than you might think. These stories don't survive by accident. They survive because people like you refuse to let them disappear. Every view, every share, every comment keeps these memories alive. You're not just watching history, you're preserving it. You're making sure that Edward Larner, Paul Gunn, and the crews of those 12 B-25s don't disappear into silence. The engineers were wrong. The B-25 modifications worked. They worked so well they changed the war. Sometimes the impossible just needs someone willing to try. Sometimes it needs someone willing to be first. Larner and his crews were first. Gunn gave them the weapon. They proved it worked. The rest is history, the kind of history that deserves to be remembered. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making sure these names and these actions don't vanish into forgotten archives. This is WW2 Shadow Tales. We'll see you in the next one.